Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to dive into a puzzle that's been around for centuries, one that sits right at that intersection between faith and, well, logic.
I mean, think about it. If you have an ancient book that claims to be from God, how in the world could you ever prove that? What kind of evidence would even work? It's a question thinkers have been wrestling with forever. Well, back in the 16th century, one man decided to build a case using reason. We're talking about the reformer John Calvin. So let's explore the arguments he laid out, piece by piece, to make his case for the Bible. And stick with us, because he makes this really fascinating turn right at the very end.
So, where does Calvin start? Well, his first piece of evidence wasn't what you'd expect. It's not about history or miracles or prophecies. Nope. He starts with the unique quality of the words themselves. He basically argued that there's just something different about Scripture that sets it apart from anything else ever written by humans.
And what's so fascinating here is how he does it. He's not trying to tear down human genius. He totally admits that guys like Plato or Cicero are brilliant. Their words can, allure you, delight you, enrapture you. But, he says, if you then turn and read the Bible, it's different. Its words work on a totally different level. They don't just impress your mind, they hit you in the heart with this weight that just makes all that other eloquent writing kind of fade into the background. So, for Calvin, here's the key takeaway. The book's divine power isn't about how beautifully it's written. Actually, he says a lot of it has a pretty rude and unrefined style. The real proof for him is in the sheer force of what it says. He believed its message was just too powerful to have come from a human mind. Okay, so let's move on to his second argument and see how this case starts to build. Now he turns to history, and he makes a pretty bold claim that the Bible's incredible age sets it apart from pretty much everything else. Calvin's whole point here is about who was first. He points out that Moses was writing centuries before the big names we think of, like the Greek and Roman thinkers. And for him, that really matters. The fact that no other religious text comes even close to being that old, well, that gave the biblical story a unique claim to being the real deal.
But you're probably thinking, hold on a minute. Just because something is old, that doesn't make it true, right? And that's the obvious question. To answer that, Calvin zooms in on the author himself, on Moses, and points to what he calls his brutal, almost self-sabotaging honesty.
Calvin's logic here is pretty straightforward. He's saying, look, if you were trying to make yourself look good and build up your reputation, would you willingly shame your own family? Would you write down the terrible things your ancestors did or the failures of your own brother and sister? And then, would you pass over your own kids for the highest job in the land? Calvin says, no way. This isn't a guy trying to gain power. This is a guy who's just obediently writing down what he was told.
Okay, but the case doesn't end there. It's not just about the text or the history. Calvin then moves on to his third big category of proof, the supernatural. And he goes right at the big skeptical argument you'd expect, one that was common even in his day, that maybe Moses was just a really good magician, pulling off some clever tricks to fool everybody. His counter-argument is really interesting. It's basically that Moses acted the complete opposite of how a fraud would act. Think about it. Why would a magician pass a law saying that all other magicians should be put to death? Why would a con man constantly refuse to take credit, always saying, it's not me, it's God? And would you really try to pull off an illusion in front of thousands of people who could easily call you out? For Calvin, the behavior just doesn't add up. It's not what a self-promoter would do. And then he brings up prophecies, which he argues are way too specific and far future to just be lucky guesses. For example, there's a prediction that a king would come from this little-known tribe of Judah, and then, centuries later, up pops King David from that exact tribe. Or even crazier, the prophet Isaiah actually names a guy, Cyrus, as the future liberator of the Jews, more than 100 years before a king named Cyrus was even born. To Calvin, these weren't just good guesses. They had to be divine messages. All right, that brings us to the fourth pillar of Calvin's case, the testimony of the people who believed it, generation after generation, without wavering.
Here, Calvin points to something really simple, the fact that the Bible even exists today. I mean, think of the attacks it faced. You had powerful empires trying to burn every copy, and brilliant philosophers trying to tear it apart with logic, and yet it survived. For Calvin, that wasn't just a lucky break. It was a sign of divine protection. And it wasn't just the book itself, but the people who carried it forward. He points to this incredible human chain. You have all these different cultures all over the world who had nothing else in common, but they all embraced this book. And maybe most powerfully, he talks about the martyrs. He says its authority was sealed in the blood of countless people who died for it, not in some crazy fanaticism, but with what he called a sober zeal.
Okay, so after building this incredible logical case from every angle, reason, history, eyewitnesses, Calvin does something completely unexpected. He makes this dramatic pivot. He basically says, you know all that stuff I just told you? All that evidence? That's not the real proof.
Yeah, you heard that right. He argues that all those powerful proofs we just walked through, they're just secondary aids. They're helpful, for sure, but they can't actually create real faith.
So what is the ultimate proof then? For Calvin, it's not an argument you hear with your ears. It's a conviction you feel in your heart. It's an internal thing. He believed it was God's Spirit directly persuading a person that Scripture is true. And that certainty, he says, is stronger than any human argument or judgment.
So you might be asking, then what was the point of all those rational arguments? Well, they're not useless. For Calvin, they're really important tools. They help strengthen a faith that's already there. They can answer questions, defend against attacks, clear up doubts, but they can't build the foundation of faith. He argues that only the Spirit can do that. And this is where he lands, with this pretty stunning conclusion. After building one of the most detailed, rational cases for the Bible ever, he turns around and says that trying to use logic alone to prove it to an unbeliever is, well, foolish. The deepest, most real certainty, he argues, goes beyond logic. It can only be understood through faith. So Calvin's whole intellectual journey is fascinating, isn't it? It's like he builds this massive, powerful fortress of reason and then tells you the real king actually lives in a totally different castle. And that leaves us with this really powerful tension to think about. It's a question that gets to the very heart of what we believe and why we believe it.